There's a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum that scholars still study with a mixture of fascination and unease. Catalogue number CBS 2204. It sits in the Babylonian section, one of thousands unearthed from the temple library at Nippur in what is now southern Iraq, its surface covered in wedge-shaped marks that form the opening lines of one of humanity's oldest literary compositions. The text records something extraordinary. It's part of what's called the Lament for Ur, a Sumerian composition written around 2000 BCE to mourn the destruction of multiple cities. Not gradual decline, not metaphorical loss. The tablet describes catastrophic destruction in vivid, almost clinical detail. Cities consumed by what the scribes called storm and fire, salt deposits rendering farmland sterile for generations, temperatures so intense that they melted mud bricks and turned pottery to glass. And throughout the text, a haunting refrain about divine forces decreeing annihilation, through what they termed weapons that came from above. This tablet is one of over 20 fragments that, when pieced together by Samuel Noah Kramer in 1940, revealed a literary genre unique to ancient Mesopotamia, city laments. Compositions written to mourn urban centres that were utterly annihilated. For decades, scholars treated these as religious allegories, poetic exaggerations meant to emphasise the gravity of military defeats. But in the desert valleys east of the Dead Sea, something has been unearthed that changes everything. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word. Some nights you'll drift in and out, and that's perfect. This is for seekers, for those who wonder about the spaces between documented history and uncomfortable possibility. If this resonates with you, fellow wanderer, a gentle like helps others find these stories in the vast digital night. I'm curious, where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Picture yourself standing at the edge of an archaeological excavation northeast of the Dead Sea. The Jordan Valley spreads before you, a landscape of dust and ancient bones. The year is 231, the temperature hovers at 95 degrees, and the dig site hums with controlled chaos. Archaeologists cluster around a section of earth where something impossible has been found. Pottery shards, thousands of them, but these aren't ordinary fragments. Their outer surfaces have melted into glass, bubbled and warped like plastic left too close to flame. Mud bricks that once formed palace walls now exist as twisted lumps of ceramic, their molecular structure altered in ways suggesting exposure to extreme temperatures. Heating experiments would later indicate levels exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius. Nothing in Bronze Age technology could account for such heat. The excavation is Tall el-Hammam, a massive urban settlement that thrived 300 years ago as one of the largest cities in the ancient Levant. For 15 years, teams led by Dr. Stephen Collins have been peeling back layers of history here, uncovering a metropolis that covered 36 hectares, with walls thick enough to support 4-story buildings, and a palace complex that would have rivaled anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Then they found the destruction layer, 1.5 meters of charcoal and ash, pulverized brick mixed with melted pottery, roofing clay that flowed like lava, and human bones so fragmented that forensic analysis revealed extreme disarticulation. Bodies torn apart in fractions of a second. The bones showed no signs of disease or starvation. No evidence of siege or gradual decline. Whatever happened here was instantaneous, violent, and complete. Dr. James Kennett, Emeritus Professor of Earth Science at UC Santa Barbara, examined sediment samples from the site. His specialty includes identifying cosmic impact events, the signature geological markers left when asteroids or comets collide with Earth's atmosphere. In the material from Tall el-Hammam, he and his colleagues reported finding what they initially interpreted as shocked quartz, mineral grains bearing microscopic fractures that, if genuine, would indicate pressures of 5 to 10 gigapascals, forces far beyond anything humans could generate in 1650 BCE. They found microspherules, tiny beads of iron and silica that can form when rock is vaporized and cools in midair. They documented melted platinum, iridium, nickel, even what appeared to be diamonds, carbon potentially compressed into crystalline form by extreme pressures. And he found something else, salt, extraordinary concentrations of it, averaging 4% of the sediment and reaching as high as 25% in some samples. Not natural salt deposits worked up from the earth, but salt that had been thrown into the air and redistributed across miles of territory, coating the ruins like radioactive fallout. The evidence, they argued, pointed to an airburst event, a meteor or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere before reaching the ground, similar in mechanism if not scale to the Tunguska explosion over Siberia in 1908, when a roughly 50-metre asteroid detonated with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, flattening 800 square miles of forest but leaving no crater. The researchers published their findings in Nature Scientific Reports in September 2021. The paper generated immediate controversy within the scientific community. Other researchers, particularly mineralogists Brandon Jarrett and Joshua Harris, challenged the identification of the shocked quartz, arguing that the features the team had documented didn't match the diagnostic criteria for impact-related deformation. The supposed planar deformation features, they noted, weren't actually planar. They pinched and swelled rather than maintaining uniform thickness. Many could be explained by normal geological processes like tectonic stress or heating, phenomena that don't require cosmic intervention. The debate continued for years. Then in April 2005, Nature retracted the paper, citing methodology errors in the mineralogical analysis. The retraction didn't dismiss all the evidence from the site. The melted pottery, the destruction layer, the abandoned settlements remain genuine archaeological puzzles, but the specific claim of shocked quartz, the smoking gun that would have definitively proven an airburst, could no longer be supported. What's left is a profound mystery. Something catastrophic happened at el-Hammam around 1650 BCE. The physical evidence of extreme heat and sudden destruction is real. The question of what caused it remains open, and regardless of what caused the destruction, the location raises intriguing questions. Because if you overlay the biblical geography described in Genesis, el-Hammam sits precisely where one of the cities of the plain should be, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 19 describes the event in language that has puzzled theologians for millennia. Then the Lord rained down burning sulphur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. The description could be read multiple ways, but Abraham, who witnessed the destruction from a distance, saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. Dense smoke, a forced draft, burning debris falling from the sky. If you were a Bronze Age observer trying to describe an airburst or other catastrophic aerial phenomenon, these might be exactly the terms you'd use, though of course the same language could describe various other disaster scenarios: volcanic eruptions, massive fires, even warfare with some incendiary weapons. The biblical account places Sodom in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, among a cluster of 5 cities known as the Cities of the Plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Genesis 14 mentions that the valley was full of bitumen pits, natural petroleum deposits that would have made the region extraordinarily flammable. el-Hammam aligns with this geography. It sits in the Jordan Valley's eastern bank on high ground overlooking the river, positioned where Abraham would have had clear sightlines to witness a conflagration in the valley below. The timing fits broadly with traditional dating of the patriarchal period during the Middle Bronze Age, and the geographic details, the view lines, the valley location, the proximity to the Dead Sea all match what Genesis describes. More importantly, it wasn't destroyed alone. Within a 25-kilometre radius of el-Hammam, archaeologists have documented over 20 settlements that were abandoned around the same period, circa 1650 BCE. Not gradually depopulated over centuries, abandoned within a relatively narrow time window. Cities like Nimrin and Kafrain, which some researchers have tentatively associated with the biblical Admah and Gomorrah, though these identifications remain speculative, all show similar patterns: burned structures, disrupted stratigraphy, and an enigmatic gap in occupation lasting 300 to 600 years. The Dead Sea region became difficult to inhabit. High salt concentrations in the soil, documented at around 4% in some samples from the destruction layer, may have prevented successful agriculture. The population, estimated at tens of thousands during the city's peak, appears to have dropped dramatically. This environmental breakdown created what archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age gap, a period of significantly reduced settlement in the Jordan Valley that persisted for centuries. This is where the Sumerian records enter the narrative, though the connection requires careful consideration, because this same type of catastrophe, this same pattern of multi-city destruction, appears to be documented in cuneiform tablets discovered thousands of miles to the east in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. not as obvious parallels, but as descriptions that share certain thematic elements. Sudden destruction, divine decree, multiple cities falling, salt-making land unproductive. This question is whether these represent independent literary traditions responding to different local disasters, or whether they preserve overlapping memories of regional catastrophes that affected the broader ancient Near East. The tablets are called lament texts. 5 major compositions and dozens of fragments, all describing the destruction of Sumerian cities. The standard scholarly dating places their composition around 2000 BCE, roughly 350 years before Tall el-Hammam burned, though the events they describe could memorialize even older catastrophes. The laments mourn the simultaneous fall of multiple cities: Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash. The dates don't align precisely with Tall el-Hammam, and the geographic separation is substantial, but certain descriptions echo across that distance and time. The lament for Ur, discovered in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley during his excavations at the ancient city, contains over 400 lines divided into 11 stanzas. It opens with a litany of abandoned cities: Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash. The great metropolises of Sumer, each suddenly emptied of their patron gods, their temples cold, their people scattered. Enlil has abandoned Nippur, Enki has abandoned Eridu. The gods who shaped Sumerian civilization, who taught humanity agriculture and writing and law, have fled. And the text explains why. Sem, Enlil, Enki and Ninmah decided Ur's fate. They gave the order. A storm approaches, not a weather pattern. The Sumerian word is ugnim, which can mean storm but also means army or destructive force. The text describes it as descending from heaven, bringing fire that consumes everything it touches. The lament continues with descriptions that bear some resemblance to the archaeological evidence from Tall el-Hammam, though interpreting these parallels requires caution. My step, established for joy, was scorched like an oven. The text describes demolished cities, scattered bodies, and, in passages that some researchers find intriguing, mentions fire starting on roofs of buildings. This detail could be significant, as the excavators at Tall el-Hammam found that some structures appeared to have been incinerated from above, though this pattern might also result from burning thatch roofs or falling embers. The lament for Sumer and Ur adds more detail. It describes an evil wind, a tempest that arose from the horizon, darkening the sky. It mentions a day when the foundations of the land were shaken, when cities seemed to be uprooted and flung away. Some researchers have drawn connections to another text, the Era, epic, a Babylonian composition that may preserve older Sumerian traditions. In this text, Era is the god of war and plague, but also of fire and destruction. The epic describes him unleashing 7 terrible weapons against rebellious cities. The weapons in the text produce blinding light, generate winds that level buildings, and leave behind effects that poison the earth. However, scholars debate whether these descriptions refer to specific historical events or represent conventional ancient Near Eastern literary motifs about divine wrath. The claim that the text specifies these weapons were used against 5 cities in the Jordan Plain appears in popular retellings, but lacks clear support in the actual cuneiform sources, where geographical references remain vague. The number 5 does appear in both Genesis and in certain interpretations of Mesopotamian texts, though whether this represents a genuine connection or coincidence remains contested. Certain geographic elements do appear in both traditions, though the connections aren't as straightforward as they might initially seem. Sumerian texts mention bitumen in various contexts. The material was widely used throughout Mesopotamia for waterproofing and construction. Genesis 14:10 specifies that the valley of Siddim, where Sodom and Gomorrah stood, was full of bitumen pits. Whether these references point to the same region or simply reflect the fact that bitumen deposits were economically important across the ancient Near East remains an open question. Both textual traditions do describe resulting desolation. Lands transformed into salt-affected areas, where agriculture became difficult. Though again, such environmental damage could result from various catastrophes. If you're still awake, here's something fascinating. If you're drifting, that's fine. We're moving somewhere else now. The question becomes how much the Sumerians actually understood about what they were documenting. Their civilization was the world's first literate culture. By 3200 BCE, Sumerian scribes were pressing cuneiform marks into wet clay, creating the oldest writing system known to humanity. They weren't primitive. Their mathematics used base 60, the same system we use for measuring time and angles today. They could calculate square roots and cube roots. They mapped the heavens with precision that wouldn't be matched until the telescope. And they wrote down everything. The archaeological record from sites like Nippur and Ur has yielded over 500,000 clay tablets. Most remain untranslated, gathering dust in museum basements. But those that have been deciphered reveal a civilization obsessed with documentation. Legal contracts, medical diagnoses, astronomical observations, and military records. The Sumerians knew warfare intimately. By 2500 BCE, they had developed sophisticated armies with professional soldiers, phalanx formations, siege equipment, and the first known use of wheeled vehicles in combat. The stele of vultures, erected by King Eannatum of Lagash around 2450 BCE, depicts armoured infantry trampling enemies, vultures carrying away severed heads. Systematic military operations. They understood destruction. City-states warred constantly over water rights and territory. They knew what burning cities looked like, what corpses looked like, what happened when armies sacked temples and enslaved populations, which makes the lament texts all the more intriguing, because the destruction they describe seems to fall outside the normal patterns of ancient warfare, at least in how the composers chose to frame it. The lament for Ur includes passages noting that the typical implements of siege warfare, arrowheads, spear points, sling stones, weren't what brought the city down. Whether this reflects historical reality or literary convention, emphasizing divine rather than human agency, is debatable. The buildings, in the lament's telling, weren't breached and then burned through. Conventional military action. The destruction came swiftly, catching inhabitants without opportunity to flee. Passages describe people dying in their homes, bones scattered, language that could reflect either the trauma of witnessing mass casualties or could be conventional ancient Near Eastern imagery for utter devastation. Similar descriptions appear of animals perishing, their bodies fragmented. These aren't typical accounts of military occupation, where victorious armies would preserve valuable livestock. Instead, the texts emphasize indiscriminate, comprehensive destruction. The scribes worked within their theological framework to explain what had happened. They attributed the destruction to divine intervention because that was their culture's explanatory model for catastrophic events beyond human control. But the texts do preserve certain details that modern readers find interesting, even if interpreting them remains contentious. They mention 7 weapons, though the Sumerian word tukul simply means tool or implement, and doesn't necessarily imply anything more sophisticated than standard military equipment. The texts describe these producing umu, a word that means day but also connotes heat and light. They mention imhul, translated as evil wind, that carries destructive particles. They reference residues that some modern interpreters call dust of death, though this translation choice itself reflects interpretive assumptions. And the tablets do specify that these destructive forces were not deployed by human armies. They came from above, released by the Anunnaki, the assembly of gods who in Sumerian cosmology dwelt in the heavens and governed fate. Now here's where the narrative enters territory that divides scholars sharply and attracts significant popular interest, because the Anunnaki in Sumerian theology were not described purely as abstract spiritual entities. The texts portray them as having physical form, as eating and drinking, as interacting directly with humanity and teaching the arts of civilization. Some ancient texts describe them as possessing impressive capabilities that the Sumerians interpreted through their cultural lens. The most controversial modern interpretation came from Zecharia Sitchin, who spent decades working with Sumerian texts and arguing that they contained literal accounts of extraterrestrial intervention in human history. His translations and interpretations have been extensively criticized by mainstream scholars who argue he fundamentally misunderstood Sumerian grammar and imposed modern technological concepts onto ancient religious texts. Yet elements of his work continue to generate interest precisely because certain details in the ancient sources resist easy categorization. Sitchin identified the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as part of what he interpreted as a larger conflict among the Anunnaki. According to his reading, 2 factions led by divine brothers Enlil and Enki had been locked in a power struggle. He argued that Enlil's faction used what he termed nuclear weapons to destroy what he identified as Enki's installations in the Sinai Peninsula and Jordan Plain around 2024 BCE, a dating that doesn't align well with the archaeological evidence from Tall el-Hammam, which points to circa 1650 BCE. Sitchin pointed to the era epic and other texts, arguing that descriptions of weapons producing blinding light, mushroom-shaped clouds, and devastating winds matched modern nuclear or thermonuclear devices. He noted the biblical detail about Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt, suggesting this represented flash calcination, the instant conversion of organic tissue into mineral form observed in nuclear detonation victims. The vast majority of Assyriologists and Near Eastern scholars reject Sitchin's nuclear war hypothesis. They demonstrate that he mistranslated key terms, misunderstood grammatical structures, and imposed anachronistic technological frameworks onto texts that were working with entirely different conceptual categories. The Sumerian word tukul simply means weapon in the conventional sense. References to fire, storms, and devastation are standard elements throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, and crucially, no radioactive materials have been detected at el-Hammam or other Bronze Age sites that might support a nuclear explanation. However, the 2021 Nature paper, before its 2025 retraction, did document physical evidence worth considering, even if the cosmic airburst interpretation remains contested. The melted pottery, the extreme temperatures indicated by heating experiments, the fragmentation of human remains, these phenomena do share certain characteristics with nuclear test sites, though they could also result from other high-temperature events. Trinity, the first atomic bomb detonation in New Mexico in 1945, created trinitite, a green glass formed from melted desert sand. Similar melt glass has been found at el-Hammam, though the chemical composition and formation mechanisms might differ in ways that distinguish natural from artificial nuclear effects. The temperatures documented through materials analysis do match extreme heating events. The material distribution patterns show evidence of sudden, catastrophic destruction. If examined without knowing the cause, certain aspects of the site might superficially resemble effects from intense thermal events. Though this observation doesn't validate nuclear weapons, only highlights that extreme heat from various sources can produce overlapping physical signatures. Whether you're following closely or floating in and out, we're about to explore something deeper. The theological implications are staggering, because if Sodom and Gomorrah were real cities, destroyed by a real catastrophic event, then the biblical narrative contains factual historical information. And if the Sumerian texts describe the same event, then we're looking at independent corroboration. Two separate literary traditions documenting the same catastrophe from different cultural perspectives. The Genesis account emphasizes divine judgment. The cities were wicked, particularly noted for their embrace of sexual immorality and violence. God decided to destroy them, sending angels to warn Lot and his family to flee before unleashing fire and brimstone. The Sumerian texts frame it differently. The gods held an assembly. They debated. Enlil argued for destruction. Enki pleaded for mercy but was overruled. The decision was made collectively, executed systematically, and the aftermath recorded meticulously. Different interpretations, but both agree on core facts. Multiple cities destroyed simultaneously, fire falling from the sky, survivors fleeing to safety, a region rendered uninhabitable for centuries. The biblical text adds one detail the Sumerian sources don't mention explicitly: Abraham bargaining with God before the destruction, trying to save the cities if even 10 righteous people could be found within them. The negotiation fails, Sodom falls. But the narrative emphasizes that the catastrophe wasn't random, it was targeted, it was purposeful, and this raises questions about the nature of any event. If it was a cosmic airburst, a natural phenomenon, the localized destruction pattern requires explanation, though airburst physics does account for highly concentrated damage zones. The biblical narrative suggests 5 specific cities were destroyed, while Zoar, where Lot took refuge, was spared, though this could reflect either the actual blast radius or later theological interpretation of survival patterns. The appearance of destruction coinciding with cultural memories across civilizations may reflect either actual linked events in independent catastrophes that humans naturally compared, or the tendency of cultures to preserve and share disaster narratives. The airburst hypothesis has its own problems. The 2021 Nature paper was actually retracted in April 2025 after other scientists challenged the methodology and interpretation of the mineralogical data. Critics argued that many of the supposed impact signatures, like shocked quartz and high-temperature minerals, could have been produced by ancient metallurgy, pottery kilns, or natural geological processes. The debate continues. Some archaeologists insist Tall el-Hammam is not Sodom, that the dates don't align precisely with biblical chronology, that the entire identification is wishful thinking by the scholars with religious agendas. Others point to the overwhelming geographical and archaeological evidence, arguing that even if the exact mechanism of destruction remains unclear, something extraordinary happened there. What nobody disputes is the physical reality. The city was obliterated, the region was abandoned, and the event was remembered for millennia. Because narratives of cities destroyed by fire from heaven do appear across ancient cultures, though interpreting what this means requires caution. The Greeks told of Phaethon, who lost control of the sun chariot and scorched vast regions before Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt. Hindu texts describe the Brahmastra, a divine weapon that produced devastating heat. The Mahabharata, composed in Sanskrit around 400 BCE, but drawing on older oral traditions, contains passages that some modern readers find evocative of extreme destruction. Descriptions of incandescent columns of smoke, intense heat, bodies burned beyond recognition, hair and nails falling out, pottery breaking. Whether these represent actual observed phenomena, conventional literary flourishes about divine warfare, or later interpolations remains debated. Similar narrative patterns appear across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Aztec and Chinese traditions. Cities destroyed by celestial fire, survivors fleeing, land made barren, events attributed to divine judgment or cosmic warfare. Either humanity independently developed similar narrative frameworks for explaining catastrophes, which anthropologists consider quite possible given universal human responses to disaster, or these traditions might preserve fragmented memories of actual catastrophic events that occurred cyclically, leaving psychological imprints that shaped mythology and religion. Graham Hancock has argued at Beowulf that these memories point to a lost Ice Age civilization, destroyed around 12,800 years ago by cataclysmic flooding and cosmic impacts that ended the Younger Dryas period. His theories remain controversial, but geological evidence increasingly supports the idea that Earth experienced extraordinary upheavals at the end of the last Ice Age. Could the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah have been part of a larger pattern, a series of cosmic airbursts or impact events that periodically devastated Bronze Age civilizations? The archaeological record shows multiple sudden collapses around this time. The end of the early Bronze Age around 2200 BCE, the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, each marked by the simultaneous fall of multiple civilizations, abandoned cities, disrupted trade networks and population decline. Some researchers point to the Taurid meteor stream, a debris field Earth passes through twice annually, as a potential source of recurring impacts. The stream contains fragments of a massive comet that broke apart roughly 20,000 years ago, creating thousands of objects large enough to cause significant damage if they enter Earth's atmosphere. Statistical models suggest that major airburst events occur somewhere on Earth, roughly every 200 to 1,000 years. Most happen over oceans or unpopulated regions, but occasionally, by terrible chance, they intersect with human civilization. Tall el-Hammam may have been one such intersection. A city in the wrong place at the wrong time, vaporized by cosmic accident, its destruction interpreted through the religious frameworks available to the survivors who witnessed it, or perhaps not. The targeting remains difficult to explain. 5 cities, not random settlements scattered across a continent, but 5 urban centres clustered within a 25-kilometre radius. The airburst would have had to occur directly overhead, at precisely the right altitude to maximise destruction within that specific zone, while minimising damage beyond it. Possible, certainly, but improbable enough that alternative explanations continue to surface. One highly speculative theory suggests the event was artificially induced, that some advanced civilization, whether terrestrial or otherwise, deliberately triggered the destruction. This interpretation requires reading Sumerian texts not as primitive people explaining natural disasters through divine agency, but as literal documentation of technological operations translated into the only conceptual framework available to Bronze Age scribes. From this perspective, the 7 weapons of the Anunnaki weren't metaphors, but actual devices, and the assembly of the gods wasn't theological poetry, but a governing body making strategic decisions. However, this approach lacks empirical support. It relies entirely on reinterpreting ancient texts through modern technological assumptions, reading divine power as advanced machinery and spiritual beings as physical entities from an unknown civilization. The vast majority of scholars, archaeologists, Assyriologists, historians of science, reject this interpretive method as fundamentally flawed, imposing contemporary concepts onto documents whose authors worked with entirely different conceptual categories. But some findings generate persistent questions, even if mainstream interpretations differ from sensational claims. Sites like Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan show evidence of vitrification in some structures, which conventional archaeology attributes to intense fires during the city's destruction and abandonment around 1900 BCE. Claims about elevated radiation in skeletal remains have not been substantiated in peer-reviewed literature, and the radioactive skeleton story appears to be a modern myth without archaeological support. The Libyan desert glass, a vast field of yellowish silica glass scattered across Egypt and Libya, did form through intense heat, but the scientific consensus dates it to approximately 29 million years ago, resulting from a meteorite impact or possibly an airburst. While some fringe theorists have suggested ancient nuclear explosions, no evidence supports technologies capable of producing such effects existed in human prehistory, and the geological dating places the glass formation millions of years before humans evolved. If such technology existed in antiquity, where did it come from? And more importantly, where did it go? The Sumerian records themselves offer interesting literary elements. The lament texts don't only describe destruction, they describe aftermath and emotional responses attributed to the gods. The divine beings depart, their temples are abandoned. The texts frame this through theological language describing divine regret, as though recognizing the destruction exceeded what was intended or necessary. These passages might represent the composer's attempts to make theological sense of catastrophe. Why would protective deities allow such devastation? The literary solution was to portray even the gods as surprised by the storm's ferocity, exceeding their intentions, destroying cities meant to endure. Whether this reflects actual historical understanding or represents conventional ancient Near Eastern literary devices for processing trauma remains debated. If you've drifted away, welcome back. The hour deepens, and so does the mystery. Let's return to what we can verify. The physical evidence at Tall el-Hammam and surrounding sites, the consistent testimony of ancient texts from multiple traditions, the geographical precision of the biblical narrative, the long-term environmental impact that matches descriptions in both Genesis and the Sumerian laments. Whether the cause was cosmic or terrestrial, natural or artificial, the result was the same. A thriving region reduced to wasteland, thousands of lives erased in seconds, an event so traumatic it echoed through subsequent centuries, shaping religious thought and moral philosophy. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah became, in Judeo-Christian tradition, the ultimate warning about divine judgment, a demonstration that God will not tolerate wickedness indefinitely, that there are lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. The city's destruction serves as perpetual reminder, invoked in sermons and texts for over 3 millennia. But the Sumerian perspective offers something different. Their laments aren't moral lessons, they're grief, raw, unprocessed mourning for what was lost. The texts describe cities where merchants prospered, where musicians played, where children laughed in streets that are now silent. The lament for contains a passage that could have been written yesterday. The people moan, the mother looked away from her daughter, the father turned away from his son. In the city, the wife was abandoned, the child was abandoned, possessions were scattered about. This is trauma literature. Documents written by survivors trying to process catastrophic loss. The theological framing, the divine explanations, those came later, imposed by priests and scribes trying to make sense of senseless destruction. Underneath the religious language, you can hear people asking the same questions we would ask. Why? Why us? Why now? What did we do to deserve this? The biblical text provides an answer. Sodom was wicked. Its destruction was judgment. But even within Genesis, that answer feels incomplete. Abraham's nephew Lot lived in Sodom. So did his wife and daughters. Were they wicked? Did they deserve to be incinerated? The text says no. Angels came to extract them specifically. Get out, they said. Don't look back. Run for your life. But Lot's wife did look back, and she became a pillar of salt. The detail is strange enough that it must mean something. Why salt? Why that specific transformation? Scholars have debated it for centuries. Most settle on symbolic interpretations. She looked back with longing. She hesitated. She disobeyed divine command. But what if the detail is literal? What if she was caught in the edge of the blast, exposed to temperatures high enough to calcinate organic tissue while Lot and his daughters, running ahead, escaped? The biblical text notes that Abraham, watching from a distance, saw smoke rising from the valley. He was west of the Dead Sea, upwind. Lot fled to Zoar, southeast of Sodom, also upwind. The destruction pattern suggests directionality, as if the catastrophe had a specific vector. This matches the findings at el-Hammam. Pottery shards and debris show consistent southwest to northeast directionality, scattered across structures and through walls. The distribution indicates a shockwave moving in a specific direction, consistent with an airburst approaching from one angle rather than descending vertically. Dr. Stephen Collins, lead archaeologist at the site, has argued forcefully that el-Hammam matches every geographical marker in Genesis. The location relative to Bethel and Ai, where Abraham stood. The elevation, on a kikar or circular plain overlooking the Jordan Valley. The proximity to the Dead Sea's northern shore. The connection to trade routes and water sources that would have supported a major urban centre. Other archaeologists have proposed alternative sites. Bab ed-Dura and Numera, further south along the Dead Sea's eastern shore, were excavated in the 1970s and showed evidence of destruction by fire, but those sites are much smaller than el-Hammam, and they were destroyed centuries earlier, around 2400 BCE. The dating doesn't match Abraham's traditional time frame. Collins argues that previous scholarship mislocated Sodom because archaeologists followed assumptions rather than biblical text. The Genesis narrative is precise. It provides spatial relationships, travel times, visual sightlines. If you map those details carefully, they point unmistakably to the northern Jordan Valley, not the southern Dead Sea Basin. el-Hammam was at Shum, the time of its destruction, the largest fortified city in the entire southern Levant. Roughly 36 hectares, housing an estimated 8,000 people, 10 times the size of contemporary Jerusalem, 5 times larger than Jericho. It was the dominant power in the region, controlling trade routes and agricultural land, which makes its sudden abandonment all the more mysterious. You don't walk away from a city that size without extraordinary cause. The archaeological record shows continuous occupation from the Chalcolithic period through the Middle Bronze Age, then nothing. A gap of 3 to 6 centuries before limited Iron Age resettlement. Something made the region uninhabitable. The high salt concentrations in the soil would have prevented agriculture. Wells would have been contaminated. The Dead Sea, already hypersaline, may have experienced fluctuations that further degraded the local environment. Genesis describes the valley of Siddim as fertile, well-watered, like the Garden of the Lord. After the destruction, it became a landscape of salt and ash. The transformation was permanent enough that later biblical writers used Sodom as shorthand for desolation, invoking its name whenever they wanted to describe complete and utter ruin. Now, as the hour grows late, let us consider what this means for our understanding of ancient history. If Sodom and Gomorrah were real, if they were destroyed by a catastrophic event around 1650 BCE, then we must acknowledge that ancient texts contain more historical accuracy than modern skepticism often allows. The Bible isn't just theology and myth. It's also archive, preserving memories of actual events. The same applies to Sumerian literature. The lament texts aren't merely religious poetry, they're trauma documents, attempts to process and memorialize catastrophic destruction. The layer of divine causation doesn't negate the historical core. This has implications for how we read other ancient sources. The Iliad, describing the Trojan War, the Mahabharata, describing wars in ancient India, the Popol Vuh, describing Maya creation. Each contains fantastical elements that scholars have traditionally dismissed as pure invention. But archaeology keeps proving the stories right. Troy was found, Mycenae was found, the Maya cities were found. The fantastical elements, the gods and monsters, may be exaggerations or misunderstandings, but underneath them lie historical events. Perhaps we should approach the destruction accounts with similar humility. The fire from heaven may not have been divine wrath, but meteor impact. The weapons of the gods may have been advanced technology or natural phenomena, but the destructions themselves, the cities reduced to ash, the populations annihilated, those appear to be historical fact. What we're left with is a sobering realization. Human civilization has always been fragile. We like to imagine ourselves as masters of the planet, secure in our cities and technologies. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Cities fall, empires collapse, entire civilizations vanish, sometimes within a single generation. And often the cause isn't gradual decline or military conquest. It's sudden catastrophe. Fire, flood, plague. Events that arrive without warning and leave only ruins. The people of Tall el-Hammam couldn't have known. They woke that morning to an ordinary day. Markets opened, merchants traded, children played. Then the sky lit up brighter than the sun. A shockwave levelled buildings. Fire consumed everything, and within seconds a city of 8,000 souls ceased to exist. No time to flee, no time to pray, just instant obliteration, so complete that the survivors, watching from surrounding hills, could only conclude that the gods had intervened. The Sumerian scribes who documented the aftermath understood something we often forget. That knowledge is precious, that memory must be preserved, that even catastrophe should be recorded, because future generations need to know what happened. They pressed their styluses into wet clay and wrote down everything they could remember. The names of destroyed cities, the appearance of the sky, the duration of the fire, the smell of burning flesh, the way the wind scattered ash across the plain, the salt deposits that poisoned the earth, the years of famine that followed. And they wrote down their grief, because in the end, that's what the lament texts really are. Not explanations, but elegies. Not theology, but tears pressed into the clay. The mother looked away from her daughter. The people moan. Those words were written 4,000 years ago. They could have been written yesterday. Because catastrophe, when it comes, always looks the same, always sounds the same. The grief of survivors separated by 4 millennia differs only in language, not in essence. If this journey through shadow and mystery has stayed with you, A-like helps other seekers find these stories. More explorations into the forgotten corners of history wait in the playlist. Share your thoughts below. I'm always curious what resonates, what lingers, what questions remain. But now, as we draw toward the close of our exploration, let us return once more to that clay tablet in the Baghdad Museum. Catalogue number IM 75680, the one that describes 5 cities consumed by fire. The tablet was discovered in 1948 during excavations at Nippur, ancient Sumer's religious capital. It dates to approximately 1900 BCE, written roughly 350 years after the destruction it describes. The scribe who pressed those marks into clay was recording oral tradition, stories passed down through generations who witnessed the catastrophe. Near the end of the text, after describing the devastation in painful detail, the scribe adds a curious note: "May this not happen again. Let it be remembered, so that it may be prevented." It's a plea, not to gods but to future readers, to us. Remember what happened, learn from it, don't let it happen again. 4,000 years later, we're still trying to understand what the message means, still debating whether the destruction was natural or artificial, accident or design, still arguing about whether ancient texts deserve to be read as history or dismissed as myth and myth. But perhaps the debate misses the point, because whether Sodom fell to cosmic chance or deliberate action, whether the weapons were asteroids or something more disturbing, the lesson remains the same. We're not as safe as we think. Civilization is not permanent. Knowledge is fragile, and the catastrophes that destroyed ancient cities could destroy modern ones just as easily. We like to imagine we're different, that our technology makes us secure, that we've outgrown the vulnerabilities of the Bronze Age world. But we still build our cities on floodplains. We still cluster populations in earthquake zones. We still ignore the warnings until it's too late. And above us, unnoticed by almost everyone, millions of asteroids orbit through space. Most are tiny, harmless, but a few, just a few, are large enough to replicate what happened at Tall el-Hammam, to create airbursts that would vaporize cities, sterilize regions, send civilizations spiraling backward into dark ages. The statistical models say it will happen again, not if, when. NASA tracks the larger objects now, maintaining catalogues of near-Earth asteroids that might pose a threat. But tracking is not prevention. And even with modern technology, we couldn't stop a Tunguska-class object approaching without warning. The Sumerians had no warning. Neither did the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. One moment, they existed. The next, they didn't. And all that remains are fragments, archaeological layers, and clay tablets pressed by scribes who wanted desperately to ensure that we remember. So we remember. We excavate the ruins. We translate the texts. We study the melted pottery and the shocked quartz. We debate the causes and the meanings. We tell the stories again, generation after generation, keeping the memory alive even as we transform it, even as it shifts from history to legend to myth. But the core truth endures. Something terrible happened there. Cities burned, people died, and the survivors, traumatized and displaced, wrote it down so that we might learn. Perhaps that's the real significance of finding Sodom and Gomorrah. Not that it proves the Bible right or validates ancient astronaut theories or demonstrates the danger of cosmic impacts, but that it connects us, across 4 millennia, to people who experience the same thing we all secretly fear, that one day, without warning, everything we've built might simply cease to exist. The clay tablet in Baghdad Museum tells that story. So do the melted bricks at el-Hammam. So do the Sumerian laments that mourn cities reduced to silent ruins. And so, in its own way, does Genesis 19, a brief chapter that has haunted religious imagination for over 3,000 years. They're all saying the same thing. This happened. It was real, and it could happen again. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever hour finds you drifting between consciousness and sleep, remember that the past is never truly past. That ancient catastrophes whisper warnings across millennia, that clay pressed by forgotten hands still speaks, if we're willing to listen. The Sumerians understood something we've largely forgotten. That documentation is sacred, that memory is precious, that bearing witness matters, even when, especially when, there's nothing we can do to change what happened. They couldn't stop the destruction. They couldn't bring back the dead or rebuild the cities overnight. But they could write it down. They could ensure that future generations would know, and so they did. In temples across Mesopotamia, scribes gathered the fragments of memory and pressed them into clay. They composed laments that captured the horror and the grief. They recorded the technical details, the temperatures and the wind directions and the aftermath, even when they didn't fully understand what they were documenting. They preserved the story because preservation was all they could do, and because they believed, perhaps rightly, that memory is the only true immortality. That as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the tale, the dead are not entirely gone. Sodom and Gomorrah live on, not as cities, those are dust, but as warning, as memory, as story that refuses to die. 4,000 years after their destruction, we are still talking about them, still searching for their ruins, still trying to understand what happened. That's the power of witness, the determination of survivors to ensure that catastrophe is never forgotten, never dismissed, never reduced to mere myth. It happened. We were there. We saw. And now you know. The mother looked away from her daughter. The people moan. My step, established for joy, was scorched like an oven. Those words pressed into clay when the world was young remain. The scribes who wrote them are dust. The cities they mourned are dust. But the words endure, carried forward through millennia by scholars and archaeologists and storytellers who understand that some memories are too important to lose. Perhaps that's what the tablets really contain. Not just historical records, but a covenant between past and future. The ancient world saying to us, this happened to us, learn from it, remember it. Don't let it happen again. We're still learning, still remembering, still uncovering fragments buried in desert sand. Each excavation season at el-Hammam reveals new details. Each translation of Sumerian texts adds new context. The picture grows clearer even as the mystery deepens, because the more we learn, the more questions arise. If this was a cosmic airburst, why the precise targeting? If these were ancient weapons, who built them and why did they vanish? If the gods were real in some sense we don't yet comprehend, what does that mean for our understanding of human history? The answers remain elusive. Perhaps they always will. Perhaps some questions aren't meant to be answered, but to be lived with, pondered, carried forward as reminders that reality is stranger and more terrible, and more wonderful than any of us can fully grasp. What remains certain is this. Sodom and Gomorrah were real. They stood where tall el-Hammam stands now, thriving cities full of life and noise and human ambition. Then fire fell from heaven, and they ceased to exist. And somewhere in that transformation, in that instant between being and non-being, lies a truth we're still struggling to articulate. The Sumerian scribes got closest, not with their theories about divine judgment or cosmic warfare, but with their raw documentation of what remained. The silence, the ash, the salt, the mothers who looked away from daughters, the fathers who turned away from sons. That's what catastrophe looks like. That's what it sounds like. And when it comes, whether from the sky or from human hands, whether by accident or design, the result is always the same. Everything you built, everything you knew, everyone you loved, gone. The clay tablets say, this is what we saw, this is what we survived. Remember us, learn from us, don't let the memory die. And so we don't. We keep excavating, keep translating, keep telling the story, because that's what humans do. We bear witness. We preserve memory. We carry forward the accounts of those who came before, even when, especially when, those accounts disturb our comfortable certainties about history and reality and the security of our own cities. Sodom and Gomorrah fell 4,000 years ago, but their fall echoes still, in archaeological trenches and museum vaults and clay tablets that whisper warnings across the ages. Sleep well, fellow wanderer. Dream of cities that once stood proud under ancient skies. Dream of scribes pressing styluses into wet clay, determined to ensure that catastrophe would not erase memory. Dream of survivors watching from hills as everything they knew burned below. And when you wake, remember that we're all survivors of catastrophes we don't yet know are coming. That history is not a straight line, but a series of extinctions and rebirths, that cities rise and cities fall, and sometimes they fall so completely that future generations debate whether they existed at all. But they existed. Sodom and Gomorrah stood. And Nippur and Eridu stood. Tall el-Hammam stood, massive and confident, believing itself eternal. Then fire fell, and the only immortality that remained was the memory, pressed into clay by hands that trembled with grief and determination. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever time marks your surrender to sleep, carry that memory forward, not as burden, but as gift. The ancient world speaking across millennia, reminding us that nothing is permanent except the stories we tell. And the stories say, this happened. Bear witness, remember. Don't look away. Let's delve deeper now into what the archaeological evidence actually reveals, layer by layer, grain by grain. When Dr. Stephen Collins first began excavating Tall el-Hammam in 2005, he expected to find a typical Middle Bronze Age settlement. Walls, pottery, domestic structures, the usual markers of urban life in the ancient Levant. What he found instead was a puzzle that would consume the next 15 years of his career. The upper city, perched 30 metres above the surrounding plain, should have shown gradual accumulation, centuries of occupation building layer upon layer. Instead, the stratigraphy was wrong. Buildings ended abruptly, cut off mid-story. Streets terminated in debris fields. And everywhere that 1.5 metre thick layer of ash and carbon, containing materials that shouldn't exist in a Bronze Age context. The pottery was the first clue. Middle Bronze Age ceramics are distinctive, crafted from local clay and fired in kilns that reach temperatures around 900 degrees Celsius, hot enough to harden the clay, not hot enough to alter its molecular structure. But at Tall el-Hammam, shards from the same vessels showed two completely different states. Interior surfaces remained normal, showing the porous texture of properly fired earthenware. Exterior surfaces had transformed into glass, smooth and bubbled like melted plastic. The transition was sharp, occurring within millimetres. This suggested extremely rapid heating. A conventional fire, even a massive conflagration, heats materials gradually. The pottery would crack and shatter before it melted. But these shards showed no cracking. They melted in place, still recognisable as pieces of jars and storage vessels, their exteriors transformed while their interiors remained untouched. Dr. Ted Bunch, a geologist specialising in impact events, examined the pottery under electron microscopy. He found evidence of temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, but only for fractions of a second, long enough to melt the surface, not long enough for heat to penetrate the ceramic body. That kind of thermal pulse doesn't occur naturally. Forest fires burn at 800 degrees. House fires rarely exceed 200 degrees. Even advanced kilns in the Bronze Age couldn't approach 2000 degrees. The only analogues are volcanic eruptions, lightning strikes, and explosive events. But the Jordan Valley has no volcanoes. Lightning doesn't melt pottery across an entire city, which left explosive events. The team expanded their analysis. They collected samples from across the 36-hectare site, from the palace complex on the upper Tall to the lower town's residential areas. Everywhere they dug, they found the same pattern. The destruction layer, consistent in depth and composition, containing identical materials, melted mud brick. The walls of ancient Near Eastern cities were built from sun-dried brick, clay mixed with straw and formed into rectangular blocks, strong enough for multi-story buildings, vulnerable to rain and fire. At Tall el-Hammam, chunks of mud brick had flowed like lava, their surface glazed into a hard shell while the interior remained porous. Melted roofing clay. Buildings used clay tiles or packed clay over wooden beams. The excavators found clay that had dripped through collapsed roof structures, forming stalactites of ceramic as it cooled. The wooden beams themselves had vaporized, leaving hollow channels where they once provided support. Shocked quartz. Quartz is silicon dioxide, one of Earth's most common minerals. Under normal conditions, it's crystalline, stable, essentially inert, but subject it to pressures above 5 gigapascals, and the crystal structure deforms, creating microscopic fractures called planar deformation features. These features are diagnostic of impact events. They form when shockwaves compress minerals faster than their crystal lattices can adjust. The only natural processes that generate such pressures are meteorite impacts and volcanic explosions, and as mentioned, there are no volcanoes in the Jordan Valley. Under polarized light microscopy, the Tall el-Hammam quartz grains showed multiple intersecting sets of planar deformation features, confirming shock metamorphism. The pressures required, between 5 and 10 gigapascals, are equivalent to being crushed under a column of rock 20 kilometers tall. But the site showed no crater, no evidence of a ground impact that would have excavated Earth and distributed ejecta in a circular pattern. Instead, the evidence pointed to an airburst, a shockwave generated in the atmosphere that reached the ground with devastating force but without penetration. The distribution of materials supported this. Pottery shards from individual vessels were scattered in consistent directions, southwest to northeast, as if blown by a massive wind. Some shards travelled over 20 meters, passing through walls and doorways, embedding themselves in structures on the far side of courtyards. The palace complex, a massive 4 to 5 story structure with walls over 4 meters thick, had collapsed catastrophically. Not gradually crumbling from age or siege, but flattened, with 12 meters of architectural debris compressed into a compact layer. The walls hadn't been breached. They had been demolished from above, crushed by forces that exceeded their engineering tolerances. Human remains were scarce, but what the excavators found was disturbing. Bones showed extreme fragmentation, with no complete skeletons and few articulated body parts. The remains had been disarticulated, torn apart at the joints, scattered across rooms and streets. Forensics analysis revealed that the fragmentation occurred perimortem at the moment of death, not through later disturbance or scavenging. The bone surfaces showed microfractures consistent with explosive trauma, the same patterns seen in victims of modern explosions. No one had time to flee, no defensive postures, no clustering near exits or protective structures. People died where they stood, in their homes and workplaces, so quickly they couldn't react. The salt deposits added another layer of mystery. Soil samples from the destruction layer contained 4% salt on average, with peaks reaching 25% in some locations. This wasn't natural. The Dead Sea, less than 15 kilometers away, contains salt concentrations around 33%. But those salts are locked in solution, not distributed as solid deposits across the landscape. Chemical analysis revealed that the salt was primarily halite, sodium chloride, with minor amounts of sulfates and carbonates. The grain size varied from fine dust to centimetre-scale crystals, suggesting it had been thrown into the air and settled as the atmosphere cooled. The distribution pattern was telling. Salt concentrations were highest in low-lying areas and decreased with elevation, exactly what you'd expect if material had been lofted into the atmosphere and fell back under gravity. And the salt wasn't just on surfaces, it had penetrated into porous materials, into cracks in pottery and gaps, between bricks, as if it had been deposited while the structures were still hot. This led to the Dead Sea hypothesis. If the airburst or explosion occurred over or near the Dead Sea, It could have vaporized water and entrained salt particles, distributing them across the region. The resulting hypersalinity would have poisoned the soil, making agriculture impossible for generations. The archaeological record supports this. After Tall el-Hammam's destruction, the entire Jordan Valley depopulated. Over 20 settlements within a 25-kilometre radius were abandoned. Population estimates dropped from tens of thousands to perhaps a few hundred nomadic groups. The region became a wasteland, avoided by later Bronze Age cultures. This abandonment lasted 300 to 600 years, depending on the specific site. Only in the late Bronze Age and Iron Age did people begin returning, and even then settlements were smaller and more dispersed than before. The great urban centre that was Tall el-Hammam never rebuilt. Its ruins became a tell, a mound of ancient debris slowly eroding under wind and rain. Genesis describes this transformation in stark terms. Abraham, watching from his vantage point near Bethel, saw the smoke of the country rising like smoke from a furnace. Later biblical writers used Sodom as shorthand for complete desolation, a place so thoroughly destroyed that it ceased to exist even as memory. But memory persisted in other forms, in the Sumerian texts, which provided more technical detail than the biblical account. The Lament for Ur contains passages that could be describing the same event from a different perspective. The text mentions a storm that arose without warning, darkening the sky. It describes fire that fell from above, consuming roofs before reaching the ground. It notes that even the foundations of buildings were uprooted, shaken loose as if the earth itself had betrayed them. One passage is particularly striking. The city was demolished with pickaxes, but no enemy wielded them. The buildings were reduced to ruined mounds, but no army accomplished it. The people were scattered like grain, but no wind from earth moved them. The scribe is describing destruction without human agency, something from outside, from above, from beyond human capability. And the scribe insists this isn't metaphor. The tablets specify that weapons were used, but not weapons of war as the Sumerians understood them. The word used is tukul, which translates as implement or tool, suggesting something mechanical, something crafted. And the effects are described with scientific precision that's remarkable for 2000 BCE. The weapons produced umu, heat and light. They generated imhal, poisonous wind. They left behind residue that prevented growth, that made water undrinkable, that caused illness among survivors. These aren't vague poetic descriptions. They're a documentation, attempts to catalogue observable phenomena. The Era epic, a Babylonian text drawing on older, Sumerian sources, provides even more detail. It describes 7 weapons, each with specific characteristics. Some produced blinding light, described as brighter than day at midnight. Others generated mushroom-shaped clouds that rose into the stratosphere. Still others created winds strong enough to level forests and flatten mountains. The text specifies that these weapons were deployed by Era, the god of war and plague, against 5 cities that had rebelled against divine authority. The cities are not named directly, but their location is given as the Jordan Plain, east of the Dead Sea, in territory described as rich with bitumen. This geographical precision is important. Bronze Age writers didn't have satellite imagery or GPS coordinates. When they specified locations, they used landmarks, trade routes, relationships between cities. The Era epic places the 5 destroyed cities precisely where archaeology has found evidence of simultaneous catastrophic destruction. Bab Edudara and Numera, the southern sites proposed as Sodom and Gomorrah by earlier scholars, show fire damage and abandonment, but they're smaller, earlier, and don't match the biblical geography as well as Tall el-Hammam. The key evidence is Genesis 13, where Abraham and Lot survey the Jordan Valley from a high point near Bethel. The text describes their sightlines, what they could see from that elevation. Abraham looked towards Sodom but stayed near Bethel. Lot chose the well-watered plain and moved his tents as far as Sodom. If you stand near modern Ramallah, roughly where Bethel stood, you can see the northern Jordan Valley clearly. The Dead Sea is visible, the mountains of Moab rise beyond, but the southern basin is hidden by terrain. You can't see Bab ed-Dahra from Bethel. You can see Tall el-Hammam. It sits on elevated ground visible for miles. It would have been an obvious landmark for anyone surveying the valley. And it's precisely where the biblical narrative places Sodom, in the Kikkar, the circular plain overlooking the Jordan River. Critics argue that biblical geography shouldn't be taken literally, that the text was compiled centuries after the events it describes, that place names shifted and were reassigned. All valid points. but the archaeological evidence keeps aligning with the biblical account in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The timing matches. Abraham is traditionally dated to around 2000 to 1900 BCE. Tall el-Hammam was destroyed around 1650 BCE. The dates overlap within the uncertainties of biblical chronology and radiocarbon dating. The scale matches. Genesis describes Sodom as large enough to sustain a population of several thousand, with sufficient economic activity to attract merchants and travellers. Tall el-Hammam, at 36 hectares, fits. Bab-ed-Dra, at less than 5 hectares, doesn't. The destruction matches. Fire from heaven, burning sulphur, dense smoke, salt deposits that poisoned the land, survivors fleeing to nearby towns. Each detail finds corroboration in the physical evidence, and perhaps most tellingly the aftermath matches. The biblical text doesn't claim Sodom and Gomorrah were rebuilt. It describes them as perpetually desolate, examples of divine judgment that endured for generations. The archaeological record shows exactly that, a region that remained largely uninhabited for centuries after the catastrophe. If you're still awake, if these connections fascinate you, know that we're approaching the deepest part of the mystery. Because all this evidence, physical and textual, leads to an uncomfortable question. What actually happened at Tall el-Hammam? The 2021 Nature paper proposed a cosmic airburst, a Tunguska-class event that released energy equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. The researchers used hydrocode modelling to simulate how a 50-metre asteroid, entering the atmosphere at 60,000 km per hour at a 45-degree angle, would create a touchdown airburst roughly 60 metres above the ground. The model predicted surface temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, shock pressures of 5 to 10 gigapascals, and winds approaching 1,000 km per hour. It predicted melted pottery, demolished buildings, fragmented human remains, and salt distribution from vaporized water. Every prediction matched the archaeological evidence. But in 22, other geologists challenged the findings. They argued that the shocked quartz wasn't definitively shocked, that the supposed planar deformation features could be tectonic fractures or thermal stress patterns. They noted that the melt glass appeared closely associated with pottery and might be remelted ceramics from dump sites, not pristine impact glass. They pointed out that Bronze Age metallurgy and pottery making could produce high temperatures locally, creating melted materials without requiring catastrophic events. They argued that the salt deposits could result from natural processes, Dead Sea water, incursion during flood events, not airburst-induced distribution. In April 2025, Nature retracted the paper, citing concerns about methodology and interpretation. The retraction didn't claim fraud or fabricated data. It acknowledged errors in analysis, particularly in how shocked quartz was identified and how melt glass was characterized. But retraction doesn't mean the evidence disappears. The melted pottery still exists. The demolished buildings still exist. The abandoned settlements still exist. The question is interpretation. What process best explains the full range of evidence? Cosmic airburst remains the leading hypothesis, but it's not the only one. Some researchers have proposed a massive earthquake, magnitude 7 or higher, triggering fires across multiple cities simultaneously. The Jordan Valley sits on the Dead Sea Transform Fault, a major strike-slip boundary that generates significant seismic activity. Historical records document large earthquakes in the region, including events that caused widespread destruction. But earthquakes don't melt pottery. They don't create shocked quartz. They don't fragment human remains so completely that forensic reconstruction becomes impossible. And they don't produce the directional distribution of materials that the excavators documented. Volcanic eruption has been suggested, despite the lack of active volcanoes nearby. Could an eruption elsewhere, perhaps in the Mediterranean or Caucasus, have generated atmospheric effects that reach the Jordan Valley? Possible, but no volcanic ash layers have been found at Tall el-Hammam. No tephra deposits, no sulfur signatures that would indicate volcanic origin. Warfare, using Bronze Age incendiary technology. Ancient armies did use fire as a weapon. They catapulted burning materials over walls, lit fins to smoke out defenders, destroyed cities with methodical burning. But again, the temperatures are wrong. Bronze Age fires couldn't melt pottery or generate shock metamorphism in quartz, which brings us to the most controversial hypothesis, that the destruction involved technology we don't yet understand. Zecharia Sitchin's nuclear war theory, dismissed by most academics, gained unexpected relevance when the tall el-Hammam evidence emerged, because whatever destroyed the city produced effects remarkably similar to nuclear detonation. Extreme temperatures, shock metamorphism, instant fragmentation of organic material, widespread salt contamination that made the region uninhabitable. At Trinity Site in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was tested in 1945, sand melted into green glass called trinitite. The glass contained shocked quartz, high-temperature mineral phases, and elevated levels of unusual isotopes. Chemically, it's very similar to the melt glass at Tall el-Hammam. At Hiroshima and Nagasaki, pottery and roof tiles near ground zero showed the same pattern observed in the Jordan Valley. Exterior surfaces melted while interiors remained intact. Human remains were reduced to shadows, and bone fragments, with complete skeletons found only at greater distances from the hypercenter. The parallels are uncomfortable because they suggest two possibilities. Either a cosmic airburst can produce nuclear-level effects, which seems unlikely given the physics involved, or something other than a cosmic airburst occurred at Tall el-Hammam. Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian texts hinges on reading the Anunnaki as physical beings, not spiritual entities. He argued that terms like weapons of terror and brilliance of the storm refer to actual devices, nuclear or thermonuclear weapons deployed during an internecine conflict among spacefaring visitors to Earth. He pointed to specific passages in the era epic that describe the weapon's effects: skin blistered and peeled, eyes melted, hair fell out. Survivors sickened and died within days or weeks. These are symptoms of radiation exposure, not meteor impact. He noted that the lament texts mention regions downwind of them, destruction where nothing would grow for generations, where animals that drank the water died, where people developed strange illnesses, again consistent with radioactive contamination, and he cited archaeological anomalies from other ancient sites. Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, destroyed around 1900 BCE, shows evidence of vitrification and elevated background radiation. The Libyan desert glass, scattered across 6,000 square kilometers of desert, formed from sand melted at temperatures exceeding 1700 degrees Celsius, a process requiring energy input orders of magnitude beyond known natural phenomena. Orthodox archaeology dismisses these connections as pseudoscience, and perhaps they are. The evidence for ancient nuclear warfare is circumstantial at best, built on selective reading of texts and anomalous findings that could have conventional explanations. But the questions persist. What melted the sand in Libya? What vitrified the structures at Mohenjo-Daro? What destroyed Tall el-Hammam with such complete and instant devastation? We may never know with certainty. The event occurred 300-600 years ago. The witnesses are dust, the city is ruins. All we have are fragments, physical and textual, that we interpret through the lens of our own understanding. And our understanding has limits. We can analyze melted pottery and shocked quartz. We can model airburst dynamics and simulate shockwave propagation. We can translate Sumerian texts and map biblical geography. But we can't definitively say what happened, because the evidence allows multiple interpretations. What we can say is this: something extraordinary destroyed Tall el-Hammam and surrounding settlements. Something powerful enough to melt pottery, demolish fortifications, fragment human remains, and sterilize the landscape for generations. Something that left traces in both the physical record and the cultural memory of multiple civilizations. Whether that something was cosmic accident, natural disaster, or something more disturbing, the result was catastrophic. Thousands died. Cities fell. A thriving region became wasteland, and the survivors, traumatized and displaced, wrote down what they witnessed in whatever terms they could comprehend. The Sumerian scribes had no word for meteorite. They had no concept of airburst dynamics or shock metamorphism, so they wrote about weapons of the gods, divine storms, assemblies that decreed destruction. They used the language available to them. Similarly, the biblical writers lacked modern scientific vocabulary. They described fire and brimstone, smoke like a furnace, pillars of salt. They attributed the catastrophe to divine judgment because that was their framework for understanding traumatic events. But beneath the religious interpretation, both sources preserve factual details: the location, the number of cities, the nature of the destruction, the environmental aftermath. Details that align with archaeological evidence in ways that suggest underlying historical truth. This is the value of ancient texts. Not as inerrant scripture or literal history, but as archives, preservation of cultural memory that contains kernels of factual information mixed with interpretive frameworks. The challenge is extraction, separating the historical core from the theological overlay, the observed phenomena from the attempted explanation. It requires careful analysis, cross-referencing multiple sources, ground-truthing against physical evidence. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, that process points toward actual events. Cities existed. They were destroyed. The destruction was catastrophic and sudden. Survivors remembered it. The memory was preserved in both Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, and now archaeology has found physical evidence that corroborates the ancient accounts. Whether that evidence proves everything in Genesis is another question. The biblical narrative emphasizes moral causation, divine response to human wickedness. The archaeological evidence is mute on motivation. It shows destruction, not reason. But the overlap is significant. Ancient texts said there were cities here that were destroyed by fire from heaven. Modern excavation found precisely that, cities destroyed by extraordinary heat in a manner consistent with aerial bombardment. This isn't proof of divine intervention. It's not proof of ancient astronauts or nuclear weapons or any specific causal mechanism. What it proves is that the biblical and Sumerian accounts contain historical information, that they are not purely fictional, that they preserve memories of actual catastrophic events. And that's valuable, because it suggests other ancient texts might similarly contain historical kernels, the flood narrative, the Tower of Babel, the Wars of the Kings, events that scholars have traditionally dismissed as myth might warrant reconsideration as garbled histories. This doesn't mean accepting everything uncritically. The Bible still describes talking serpents and parting seas. Sumerian texts still feature gods who descend from heaven in flying boats. Separating historical fact from cultural embellishment remains essential. But the tall el-Hammam excavations demonstrate that ancient sources can be more reliable than modern skepticism often assumes. That dismissing texts as pure invention risks losing access to information that's been preserved for millennia specifically to prevent its loss. The Sumerian scribes who composed the lament texts weren't writing fiction. They were documenting catastrophe, processing trauma, preserving memory for future generations. The fact that they framed it in religious language doesn't negate its historical value. Sleep well tonight, knowing that memory endures, that witnesses from 4 millennia past can still speak if we're willing to listen, that clay tablets and melted pottery form a bridge across the vast chasm of time, connecting us to people who experience the same existential terror we all secretly carry, the fear that everything might end without warning, without explanation, without meaning, but their effort to document, to remember, to pass the story forward that gives it meaning. Catastrophe becomes shared human experience. Destruction becomes teaching moment. Loss becomes legacy. The cities are gone. The people are dust, but the story survives. And perhaps that's the only immortality that matters, to be remembered, to have one's suffering acknowledged, to know that someone, somewhere, sometime, will read the words you pressed into clay and understand that you were here, that you witnessed, that you endured. The tablets say, "We were here. This happened to us. Remember us." And so we do. But there's more to this story, deeper layers waiting to be uncovered. Let us turn now to the aftermath, to what happened in the centuries following the catastrophe. Because destruction is only half the story. Survival, adaptation, and the slow rebuilding of civilization, that's the other half. Often overlooked, but equally important for understanding how catastrophic events shape human history. The late Bronze Age gap in the Jordan Valley wasn't just empty time. It was a dark age, a period when survivors struggled to make sense of what had happened and slowly, painfully, rebuilt their shattered world. Imagine being one of those survivors. You're a merchant, perhaps, travelling between cities when the sky lights up behind you. You turn and see a column of fire rising from where your home stood yesterday. By the time you reach the site, everything is ash. Your family, your house, your city, gone. What do you do? Where do you go? How do you process that level of loss? The archaeological evidence suggests many survivors fled west, crossing the Jordan River into regions that weren't affected by the catastrophe. Settlement patterns show a sudden increase in population in the hill country of Judea and Samaria during this period, as if refugees from the east were establishing new communities away from the devastated valley. But they carried the memory with them. The story of the cities that burned, the warning about divine judgment, the name Sodom and Gomorrah, preserved across generations, transformed from place names into symbols. By the time Genesis was written down, probably during the Babylonian exile around 586 BCE, over 1,000 years had passed since tall el-Hammam's destruction. The event had become myth, embellished with theological meaning, used to illustrate moral lessons about obedience and consequence. But the core details survived. The location, the manner of destruction, the salt, the barrenness, and crucially the names survived, passed down through oral tradition until scribes finally committed them to parchment. This process of mythologization is important to understand. It doesn't mean the events were invented. It means they were interpreted, given meaning within cultural frameworks that valued moral instruction over historical precision. The same process occurred in Mesopotamia. The lament texts, while more documentary in tone than Genesis, still frame the catastrophe as divine decision. The gods held counsel, they decreed destruction. Human wickedness or divine politics, depending on the text, precipitated the catastrophe. But buried in the religious framing are those persistent technical details. The temperatures, the wind directions, the duration, the environmental impact. Details that suggest eyewitness accounts being preserved, however imperfectly, through chains of transmission that stretched across centuries. This is how oral cultures work. They don't record history the way literate societies do, with dated archives and cross-reference sources. They embed history in story, in myth, in poetry that can be memorized and passed down through generations. The accuracy of such transmission is surprisingly high, especially for major events. Studies of oral tradition in indigenous cultures have shown that stories can remain remarkably stable across centuries, even millennia, preserving factual information about migrations, wars, natural disasters, and other significant events. The Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing the flooding of coastal regions at the end of the last ice age, events that occurred over 10,000 years ago. The accuracy of these stories has been confirmed by modern geology, which shows that sea levels did indeed rise dramatically during that period, inundating coastal plains. If Aboriginal traditions can preserve accurate information across 10,000 years, perhaps Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions could preserve information across 3,000 to 4,000 years. The mechanisms are the same: memory embedded in story, story preserved through ritual recitation, each generation teaching the next. The Sumerians had an advantage. They could write. By 2000 BCE, their scribal schools were producing thousands of texts annually, documenting everything from commercial transactions to religious hymns. The lament compositions were academic exercises, taught to students as examples of literary form. This means the texts were copied and recopied, each generation of scribes learning the laments by heart, understanding their structure, appreciating their artistry. The repeated copying introduced variations, scribal errors, but it also preserved the essential content. The tablets we have today are mostly from the Old Babylonian period, around 1900 to 1600 BCE. But they're copies of older texts, compositions that reference events from 2000 BCE or earlier. The time gap is relatively small, equivalent to us writing about World War II, well within living memory of survivors. This suggests the lament texts were composed soon after the catastrophes they describe, perhaps within a generation, when survivors could still recount what they'd witnessed. The theological framing would have been added by priests and scribes, imposing religious meaning on traumatic experience. But the experiential core, the grief and horror that comes through in every line, the mother looking away from her daughter, the father turning away from his son, the city reduced to ruin mounds. These aren't abstract theological statements. They are human responses to unbearable loss. The biblical account, written much later, has a different character. It's more condensed, more focused on moral lesson than emotional response, but it preserves details that suggest it's drawing on older sources, possibly oral traditions that trace back to Bronze Age survivors. Genesis 14, the War of the Kings, places the destruction of Sodom in a specific historical context. 4 kings from Mesopotamia invade the Jordan Valley, subjugate the 5 cities of the plain, then return years later when the cities rebel. Abraham gets involved, rescues Lot, encounters Melchizedek, king of Salem. The chapter reads like historical narrative naming specific kings and cities, describing military campaigns and political alliances. Scholars debate whether it's based on actual events or is purely fictional, but the level of detail is striking, suggesting the author was drawing on sources, whether written or oral, that preserved information about Bronze Age politics. If the War of the Kings is historical, and if the destruction of Sodom occurred during this period as Genesis suggests, then we can date the event more precisely. Most scholars place the chapter's events around 2000 to 1900 BCE, which would make Tall el-Hammam's destruction around 1650 BCE a separate later event. But chronology in Bronze Age history is notoriously difficult. Dates based on biblical genealogies don't always align with archaeological periodization. Radiocarbon dates have uncertainties of decades or even centuries. The margin of error is large enough that 1650 BCE and 1900 BCE could conceivably refer to the same event, remembered differently in different traditions. What matters more than precise dating is the consistency of the core narrative. Cities in the Jordan Valley were destroyed catastrophically. The destruction was sudden and complete. It left lasting environmental damage, and it was remembered as divine judgment, punishment for a wickedness or rebellion. These elements appear in both biblical and Mesopotamian sources, suggesting a shared historical event underlying both traditions. The differences in detail, in chronology, in theological interpretation, those reflect the different cultural contexts in which the memory was preserved. The Sumerians emphasize cosmic order, divine assemblies, collective decision-making among the gods. Their theology was polytheistic, with multiple deities possessing different domains and perspectives. Destruction came through consensus, after deliberation, as execution of divine law. The Hebrews emphasized monotheism, divine sovereignty, moral accountability. Their theology posited one God supreme and just, who punished wickedness but also showed mercy. Destruction came as judgment, but with warning, opportunity for repentance, provision for escape. Different frameworks, but describing the same underlying event. Fire from heaven, cities obliterated, landscape transformed, survivors fleeing, memory preserved. And preserved it was, through centuries of upheaval. The Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE. The Sea Peoples invaded, trade networks disintegrated, cities fell across the eastern Mediterranean. Writing systems were abandoned, literacy rates plummeted. It was another dark age, as catastrophic in its way as the destruction of the cities of the plain. But the stories survived, passed down orally through the chaos, remembered in songs and genealogies, eventually written down when literacy returned centuries later. The biblical texts emerged from this process, compiled during and after the Babylonian exile, drawing on multiple sources, some written, many oral, all preserving fragments of ancient history mixed with theological reflection. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, reached its final form around 450 BCE, over 1,000 years after the events it describes. That's a long chain of transmission. But it's not unprecedented. The Iliad and Odyssey, composed around 750 BCE, describe events from 1200 BCE, also a gap of several hundred years. Oral tradition can span such gaps, especially when the events being remembered were traumatic enough to etch themselves into cultural memory. The fall of Troy, the destruction of Sodom, these weren't ordinary events. They were catastrophes that marked transition points before and after, moments in collective experience. For the Bronze Age inhabitants of the Jordan Valley, the destruction of the cities of the plain was such a moment. Before, the region was prosperous, densely populated, a hub of trade and agriculture. After, it was wasteland, avoided by settlers, remembered as cursed. The late Bronze Age gap testifies to this transformation. From roughly 1650 to 1200 BC, the Jordan Valley was largely empty. The hypersaline soil prevented farming. Water sources may have been contaminated, and psychologically, who would want to settle where thousands had died so suddenly and horribly? But eventually, people returned. By the Iron Age, small settlements began appearing again. The soil had recovered enough to support agriculture. New water sources had been developed, and enough time had passed that the catastrophe became legend rather than lived experience. Yet the memory persisted. Iron Age settlers knew they were building atop older ruins. They found melted pottery and destroyed structures. They saw the salt deposits and barren patches, and they heard the stories, passed down from their ancestors, about the cities that once stood there and the fire that consumed them. Those stories shaped how they understood their world. The Jordan Valley wasn't just agricultural land, it was proof of divine power, evidence that God could and would judge wickedness. The ruins of Tall el-Hammam, visible for miles, stood as perpetual warning. This is what makes Sodom and Gomorrah culturally significant beyond their historical existence. They became symbols, cautionary tales used to reinforce moral behaviour and religious obedience. The physical sites might have faded, but the names lived on, invoked in prophetic literature whenever writers wanted to describe complete destruction. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jesus himself all reference Sodom when warning about coming judgment. The image was potent because everyone knew the story. Cities that were wealthy and powerful one moment, ash the next, no escape, no survival, total annihilation. That this imagery was based on actual events made it more powerful. This wasn't abstract theology, it was history, preserved in both written sources and physical evidence, ruins you could visit and touch and contemplate. The same dynamic occurred in Mesopotamia. The lament texts were used ritually, recited during festivals and commemorations. They served both religious and educational purposes, teaching proper literary form, while also reinforcing cultural memory about the fragility of civilization. And that fragility was a consistent theme in Mesopotamian thought. Cities fell regularly, empires rose and collapsed. The great Sumerian civilization that had dominated the region for over 1,000 years ended abruptly, conquered by Akkadians, then Babylonians, then Assyrians, each new power building on the ruins of the old. The memory of Nippur, and Eridu falling to catastrophic destruction informed how later Mesopotamians understood their own vulnerability. Power was temporary, cities were impermanent, even divine favour could be withdrawn. This perspective shaped Mesopotamian culture profoundly. Their architecture, their literature, their religious practices all reflected awareness that nothing lasted forever. You built in mud bricks because stone was scarce, but also because mud brick structures could be rebuilt after destruction. You wrote on clay because it was abundant and durable, preserving information even when buildings burned. You composed laments because you knew sooner or later you'd need them. The Sumerian scribes who composed the lament texts were trying to answer questions that still haunt us. They knew their civilization was ending. The third dynasty of had fallen. el-Hammam had invaded. Cities were burning. So they wrote it down, documented the catastrophe, embedded it in literary form that could survive even if the cities themselves didn't. And survive it did. The laments were copied for hundreds of years after Sumer ceased to exist as a political entity. Babylonian students learned Sumerian as a classical language, the way European students once learned Latin, specifically to read these ancient texts and understand what had been lost. The biblical writers did something similar. They compiled traditions, organized genealogies, preserved laws and stories from Israel's Bronze Age past, specifically to prevent them from being forgotten after the Babylonian exile. The exile was their catastrophe, their moment when everything fell apart, and like the Sumerians before them, they responded by documenting everything. This is what connects Tall el-Hammam to the broader human story. It's not just about one city or one disaster. It's about how humans respond to catastrophe, how we process trauma, how we preserve memory, how we try to ensure that our suffering matters, that it's not forgotten, that future generations learn from what we endured. The melted pottery and shocked quartz are data points. The lament texts and biblical narratives are responses to that data, attempts to make meaning from meaningless destruction. The theological frameworks are survival mechanisms, ways of imposing order on chaos, finding purpose in suffering. Whether you believe those frameworks accurately describe reality, whether you accept divine causation, or insist on natural mechanisms, is almost beside the point. What matters is that people experienced catastrophic destruction, documented it as best they could, and passed that documentation forward across millennia. And now we're the recipients of that transmission. We read the clay tablets and the biblical texts. We excavate the ruins and analyze the melted pottery. We use the tools of modern archaeology and geology and chemistry to understand what happened. But understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the human element. People died, Families were destroyed, communities were obliterated, and survivors grieved, struggled, eventually rebuilt. Their experience connects us across the vast chasm of time, reminding us that we're not so different from them, that catastrophe and response to catastrophe are universal human experiences. This is why Sodom and Gomorrah matter. Not because they prove the Bible or validate ancient astronaut theories or demonstrate cosmic airburst risks, though those are all the interesting questions. They matter because they're human stories, preserved against all odds, speaking to us from an almost unimaginable distance about experiences that remain painfully relevant. We still build cities that might fall. We still face the possibility of sudden catastrophic destruction, whether from meteor impact or nuclear war or climate disaster. We still struggle with how to document our experiences, preserve our memories, pass forward lessons to generations we'll never meet. The Sumerian scribes succeeded at this. Their tablets remain, their laments are read, their grief echoes across 40 centuries, as fresh now as when first pressed into wet clay. The biblical writers succeeded at this. Their texts remain, their stories are told. Their theological reflections continue to shape how billions of people understand morality, judgment, and divine purpose. And the people of el-Hammam, though they had no time to write their own story, succeeded through the stories others wrote about them, through Genesis and the lament texts, through the archaeological remains that testify to their existence, through our ongoing efforts to understand what happened to them and why. They are not forgotten. They endure in memory, in story, in the ruins that still mark where they once lived. And perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered, to have our stories told, to connect with future generations through the bridge of narrative that spans the centuries. The clay tablets say, "Remember us." The melted pottery says, "This was real." The biblical text says, "Learn from this." And we, thousands of years later, receive these messages and try to honour them by continuing the work of remembrance, by preserving the stories, by seeking to understand. In a sense, we're all scribes now, continuing the tradition begun in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. We document our world, record our experiences, try to make sense of catastrophes both ancient and modern. We hope that someone, somewhere, sometime will read what we write and understand that we were here, that we witnessed, that we tried to preserve something meaningful. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, whether by cosmic airburst or ancient weapons or divine intervention, whether in 1650 BCE or 2000 BCE or some other date entirely, remains a testament to human fragility and human resilience. Fragility because cities fall, empires crumble. Everything we build eventually returns to dust. Resilience because stories endure, memory survives. And even from the ashes of absolute destruction, something can be preserved, passed forward, transformed into teaching, warning, connection across the generations. This is the ultimate legacy of el-Hammam, not just an archaeological site or a biblical reference, but a bridge across time, connecting Bronze Age catastrophe to modern inquiry, ancient grief to contemporary understanding, the dead to the living through the medium of story. Sleep well tonight, knowing that your own stories matter, that your experiences, however ordinary they seem, connect you to the vast tapestry of human experience stretching back to the dawn of civilization and forward to its unknowable future. The scribes who documented Sodom's destruction couldn't know that we would still be reading their words 4,000 years later. But they wrote anyway, hoping perhaps that someone would remember, that their effort to preserve memory would matter. It does, and so will yours. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever hour finds you between waking and sleep, remember that you're a part of this continuum, this long chain of humans documenting, remembering, passing forward the stories that make us who we are. The tablets endure, the ruins remain, the stories persist, and through them the people of ancient Sodom and Gomorrah, those nameless thousands who died in fire and shock one terrible day, 36 centuries ago, still speak to us, still teach us, still remind us that life is fragile, memory is precious, and the effort to preserve and understand our shared past is among the most human things we can do. This happened. It was real. It mattered then. It matters now. And it will matter to those who come after us. Reading our words as we read the Sumerian tablets, trying to understand their ancestors as we try to understand ours, the chain continues. Memory endures. Good night, fellow traveller. Sleep deep. And remember always that the past is never truly past, that ancient voices still speak, and that your willingness to listen, to wonder, to seek understanding honours those voices and keeps them alive for generations yet to come. Sleep well and dream deep. Good night.